Research, Reform, Revive. Korczak Radio. For an eco-humanistic, pluralistic voice on the School of Life Garden Net.
On September 1st, 1939, with the German invasion of Poland, the voice of the old doctor, Stary Doktor, appeared on the waves of Radio Polski. Despite an order for all staff to evacuate the building, Janusz Korczak was one of a few to stay in order to broadcast from the Warsaw II radio station. Once again, he spoke to the children as equals, as he had done so many times during his popular radio show in the preceding years. This time, however, he did not talk about education, nor about philosophy or society, but rather provided a first aid radio show, during which he explained to his listeners, the children, what was happening all around them. It was not until 3 weeks later, on September 23rd, 1939, with German shells encroaching on the radio station, that he abandoned his shift. This was the last time that Janusz Korczak signed off. And it is this frequency that we seek to renew today. It is the frequency of a human-loving physician, an educator, writer, journalist, public administrator, social entrepreneur, and human rights activist. Following the poet William Wordsworth, Janusz Korczak saw, in the child, the father of the man. And from this insight, he developed his entire humanist, democratic, multicultural approach that directly positioned the child within the adult, and vice versa, and sought to heal, in times of severe social, political, and spiritual distress, the complex human condition. As we honor Janusz Korczak and the children who perished in Treblinka, we seek to revive their ethos, not only of tragedy or heroism, but rather those of vitality, growth, and creativity. To water the seeds that were sowed nearly a century ago and embark on a path of healing and repair today.
Genug gejammert echterer und neus gewähnt dem Pein. Se Mame Eufen von Nacht, a weißen Kiel und Schein, a weißen Kiel und Schein. Se Mame Eufen von Nacht, a weißen Kielenschein. A es liegt mein Töchter, a es liegt nicht mehr. Auf Puste Wälder soll es gehen, und schon nicht kommen mehr, und schon nicht kommen mehr. Auf Puste Wälder soll es gehen, und schon nicht kommen mehr. Wie kann es denn a teues Lied go sein? Zappelt doch mein eigen Herz in weißen Kielenschein, in weißen Kielenschein. Zappelt doch mein eigen Herz in weißen Kielenschein.
Helen Chayele Beer grew up in Australia, the child of Holocaust survivors on her mother's side. Yiddish was her first language, which she read and wrote before English. She started teaching Yiddish from the age of 17. After completing university studies in musicology, English literature, and pedagogy, she pursued academic studies in Yiddish in Jerusalem while working for professor of folklore Dov Noy. Helen gained her PhD in Oxford, followed by academic Yiddish positions in Oxford and then in London. She has taught for many Yiddish summer courses throughout Europe and is director of the annual intensive Yiddish summer course, Ot Azoy, in London. In addition, she has always been immersed in music and theater projects and is currently directing a Yiddish play to be staged in London. Between the years of 2007 and 2020, she wrote annual Purim spiels in rhymed Yiddish that were performed by students and colleagues and always set within contemporary political and social realities.
Welcome all listeners from near and far to the launching of Radio K, named in honor of Janusz Korczak, who was born as Henrik Goldschmidt in either 1878 or 79, it's not clear. I've always been a great fan of radio broadcasts, and so it is a great honor to be speaking to you all from a small island. I hope that you are all keeping safe and well. As we mark Holocaust Memorial Day, I feel the gravity and importance of this day. The millions of precious lives lost have been engraved in my own awareness for as long as I can remember. The name Janusz Korczak came to light very early in my life in the Yiddish children's magazines which I read as a child. Who knows? Perhaps they may even have been partly inspired by the little journal which Korczak produced for the children in his Warsaw orphanage. Who or what do we commemorate and remember? Lives lost, family histories, lived experience, and historical events. Remarkable moments in the lives of those who faced extreme adversity and or death. Extraordinary individuals such as Korczak, who always existed at the center of his own moral compass, his moral conscience. I am struck by how quickly the details of lives lived in the past are forgotten. So much remains unknown or lost in the transition from even one generation to the next. Korczak declined many offers from Polish friends and colleagues to save himself, his own life, from the Warsaw Ghetto and from the final deportation to Treblinka. For Korczak, it would have been unthinkable to abandon his orphaned children, his adopted family, during a time of hunger, deprivation, and terror. He had never been a person who was ready to sell his soul for personal gain. Korczak's life prior to the Second World War was not always easy, but it was and remains truly remarkable and inspirational. In modern times, so many aspects of his life address the questions and values which confront human beings. Our understanding of the world and our place in it, the search for truth, justice, and meaning. What does it mean to be human? And what about the role of luck and chance in every life? We are all born in a particular time and place. How much control do we have? And when dark forces, larger than the individual, exert an uncontrollable power, where does that leave the individual or any group of individuals? Korczak planted so many seeds which can be sown into our own consciousness, conscience, and life journey. He merged creativity with his initial career as a medical doctor and pedagogue. He began writing at an early age, both fiction and non-fiction, and started tutoring children, often teaching them to read. From an early age, he was acutely aware of the poor and the homeless. He engaged with children on the streets and later took courses in psychology with a fascination for child development. He didn't recognize class or ethnic divisions and didn't believe in compromising one's own principles. In 1910, he planned to give up his medical career in order to become director of a Jewish orphanage, which he subsequently did. His pedagogical approach was innovative and experimental. Korczak supported the rights of every child and argued that war leads to injury and killing, which deprives children of the right to happiness and to life itself. Most importantly, he understood the importance of love, empathy, of listening to children and giving them a voice. His medical expertise complemented his work at the orphanage. He was able to treat children and colleagues if there were health issues, medical problems. In some ways, aspects of Korczak's life intersect with my own family history and in part with my own life. My mother and 3 of her 4 siblings survived the Lodz ghetto and 4 concentration camps. My grandparents were killed in Auschwitz. In Lodz before the war, my grandfather grew exotic plants, bred canaries, loved music, and had a fabulous voice. He was a chazan. He read a lot and took care of 4 orphans alongside his own 5 children in a home with limited space. To the frustration of his wife, my grandfather, like Korczak, often gave food to the needy in the ghetto, thereby frequently going hungry himself. I never met my Zayde, but he has always been an inspiration. Much of my working life has been devoted to teaching and pedagogy in many contexts, privately, schools, universities. My personal approach and things I have learned has some overlap with Korczak. The importance of listening to children, to students, trying to understand each individual in order to appreciate his or her own circumstances and specific educational needs. The significance of creativity in teaching and learning. The role that music and theatre can play in learning, with everyone working towards achieving a collective goal whilst forging close friendships. A means of bringing about transformations in troubled young and older people by providing them with emotional outlets through the performing arts. Korczak incorporated nature into his work in the orphanage. There were expeditions with the children into the natural world. Plants were brought into the orphanage. He brought small animals, birds into the home, which the children would help to care for. There were music and theatre performances. Just before the tragic demise of Korczak and his children, they performed a play about an orphan, The Post Office, written by the Bengali writer and artist Rabindranath Tagore. On the small island where I live, there are some worrying developments. I will name just a few. The closure of many libraries, depletion of facilities for the poor and disadvantaged, erosion of opportunities in the creative arts, and a reductive prescribed approach to teaching and learning in schools. Korczak's humanistic, creative, inclusive approach and ethos feels as important and innovative now as it did a century ago, perhaps even more so. Towards the very end of his life, when reflecting on life in general and his own in particular, Korczak wrote in a diary, and I quote, "While you lived, did you observe languidly as life flowed by? Did you steer the course, or were you carried along?" Janusz Korczak certainly steered his own course and paved his own way. We must never forget the difference he made to so many lives. We can no longer hear his voice over the radio waves, but we can plant many seeds and look after them with care.
Gespenster, steht auf in Nacht von der nachtischen Schule. A Schames, was neigt sich und ruft in der Stil. In Schule herein, wenn es schreckt die Nacht, das Licht in Kläuser wie Reus getracht. Klettert da gegen auf neuester Wand, a Galle, a Schwarzer, dem Zählem in Hand. In Kläuster herein, wenn es schreckt die Nacht, das Licht was Blätter wie Reus getracht. Fieber wie Nacht, der Wind und der Regen, kommen zu schwimmen von Wegen und Schlägen. A Hilfele Goyim, a Hilfele Jeden, von Nacht Asil, von Merk und Jariden, tappen sie Blinde und suchen die Tieren. Wer soll gerufen, wer soll uns wehren? Blitzt auf a Rege, a Toyes Schein, gehen die Goyim in Schule rein. Blitzt auf a Rege, a Toyes Schein, gehen die Jeden in Klöster rein. Verriegelt die Nacht hinter alle die Tieren. Das Licht was geht rufen, das Licht geht verkehren. Zerwähnt sich der Kopf in nachtischen Fenster. Gott was nach Gott und sind ewige Gespenster.
Moshe Shner is a senior lecturer at Oranim College. Shner received his PhD in Jewish philosophy from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in New York City, where he studied the impact of the Holocaust on Jewish identity. Currently, he is a lecturer of Jewish philosophy and heads the History and Philosophy Department of Oranim College. His academic teaching includes topics in Jewish philosophy, Jewish education, Holocaust education, and the challenge of modern Jewish identity, interfaith dialogues, and multicultural education in a post-Holocaust world. A special place in his writings and teaching is dedicated to the legacy of the Polish Jewish educators Janusz Korczak and Yitzhak Katzenelson.
Shalom, my name is Moshe Shner, a history professor at Oranim Teachers College in Israel. Why Korczak? Korczak, Henrik Goldschmidt in his birth name. His image was present in my childhood world. The elementary school I attended was named the Janusz Korczak School. Beautifully illustrated Polish stamps carried Korczak's picture and an illustration from his book. I had those stamps in my album, which regretfully later I lost. The image of Korczak's literary hero, Karl Maciusz Pierci, King Math I, on display in the school's library. We are familiar with the story of the child king who tried but failed to establish a children's kingdom that will achieve social justice and welfare for all. However, Korczak's story was still just one of many that I heard at home and at school of people who struggled heroically with the Nazi reality. It was when I became an educator myself and read Korczak's pedagogical writings that he became an essential element of my spiritual landscape. Yitzhak Perlis's introductions to the 4 volumes of the Ghetto Fighters Museum Hebrew edition of Korczak's writings guided my exploration of Korczak thinking. Discussions with my father, Tzvi Shner, a Holocaust historian and one of the founders of the Ghetto Fighters House Holocaust Museum, located on the ground of the Ghetto Fighters Kibbutz in Israel, introduced me to deeper layers of Korczak's legacy. I have pondered Korczak's work for nearly 4 decades, and it continues to enrich my pedagogical thought. As inspiring as his writings have been for me, I learned when I became an academic teacher that Korczak's essays on education have had difficulties finding their place in the academic world. The historical discourse about Korczak has overshadowed his pedagogical contribution and relegated him to Holocaust and genocide studies. For the public, Korczak is a Holocaust martyr. His inspiring actions have had the unintended effect of narrowing his legacy to a story of martyrdom. They overshadow 40 years of inspiring educational work and do not do justice to his true meaning and place in the history of humanistic pedagogy. The nature of Korczak's writings further obscures their real value. Their fragmented character make it difficult to accept his pedagogical legacy as a respectable part of the philosophy of education. Korczak was suspicious of elaborate educational theories, for reasons we may later discuss, and the surface reading of his texts hardly reveals clear structured philosophical thinking. They appear more like a flow of thoughts and an arbitrary cluster of beautiful ideas than rational, integrated, and disciplined discourse. In most cases, Korczak's scholars chose to tell his life story and the story of his work with children, leaving out efforts to extract a philosophy out of his legacy. Does Korczak belong to the field of Judaic studies? Korczak's unclear national identity adds to the difficulty of granting Korczak's shelf space in academic libraries alongside other Jewish philosophers. What is his authentic context? Maybe he is better being placed on the Polish philosophy shelf. His stance in between different cultural and national worlds is not belonging to one social circle or one defined cultural identity complicates and moves Korczak's legacy away from the field of modern Jewish thought as demarcated today. It seems that his thought is not Jewish enough, according to the traditional categorization of Jewish identity, which I do not accept. As a result, despite being appreciated as a world-renowned educator, Korczak's thought is categorized neither as a philosophy of education nor as a Jewish philosophy. It is often missing from the 20th century humanistic discourse. Teachers, colleges, and university schools of education tend to ignore his thought. It is rarely studied in teachers' education programs and philosophy of education courses. My work with Korczak aims to emancipate Korczak's legacy and find it a proper, respectable place in the academic field of philosophy of education. Korczak is important not only because of his pioneering educational ideas and practices, his idea about the dignity of all human beings, the dignity of the child, the respect to the child's world, the respect to the children's rights. As many of his Jewish generation, Korczak cherished the idea of one humanity, without divisions between Jews and Christians, Jews and Arabs, different races, white and black, social classes, poor and rich, genders, men and women, boys and girls. He dreamed about the idea of one humanity, a monotheistic sociality, one world, one ethics, one humanity. The greatest Jewish dream in the first half of the 20th century was not Zionism, but the full emancipation and the full integration into the European landscape. It was not only Korczak's dream. Like Korczak, my own father, Shner, was a graduate of Warsaw University, an officer in the Polish army, a fan of the Polish culture, a fan of Polish food. But history showed him, like millions of European Jews, that it is an illusion. They were pushed out of the Polish society, of the German society, of the Austrian society, of every other country. The Jews, as they learned bitterly, needed a national homeland, a place where they will be able to be secure. Korczak was not a Zionist. He was never a member of the Zionist movement. He cherished a universal dream like the biblical prophecy of Isaiah, that in the end of days, all the people of the world will unite around the cause of the child. Maybe, he said, in Jerusalem, there will be a new League of Nations organization that will deal with humanity and with the cause of the child. Of course, we know how Jerusalem is today. Zionism is a national dream, and yet, without Korczak ideas, it can turn to be a nationalistic project. Instead of blessing to the whole humanity, like other nationalistic society, a curse to the rest of humanity. Israel, as any other state in our world, must be a moral, humanistic project. Even though every state will have a national identity, its doors and windows should be open to every human being in the world, looking for one ethics for all, for the dignity of every human being, and for, of course, for the emancipation of all the children in the world. Thank you very much.
Research, reform, revive. Korczak Radio. For an eco-humanistic, pluralistic voice on the School of Life Garden Net.